Hello, everybody. My name is Cliff Smith. I'm the Washington Project Director of the Middle East Forum, and welcome to our webinar and speaker podcast and webinar series. And welcome to Shay Khatiri, our guest. It is no secret to anyone in the past couple of months that the foreign policy story that has dominated the headlines is Russia's invasion of Ukraine. This unprovoked war of aggression is the first significant conflict on European soil since World War II, and it has shocked the world and has rightly absorbed almost the entire news cycle when it comes to foreign policy. Yet the Middle East is not far off, and it plays a significant role. The Black Sea borders both Ukraine and Russia, as well as Turkey. Istanbul has served as a place for Ukrainian-Russian negotiations. Iran and Russia are strategic allies, and Russia has been serving as an interlocutor on Iran negotiations over Iran's nuclear program. Arab states, on the other hand, fear Iran, but have been hesitant to provoke Russia. Israel, too, has been concerned about the Russian troops near its borders in Syria. And while it has condemned Russia, it has been hesitant to do other things, which has led to internal debate in Israel. The list could go on and on. Today, we have someone who is uniquely positioned to discuss the wider issue of how the Russia-Ukraine conflict deals with Iran and the rest of the Middle East. Shay Khatiri is a specialist in Russia and Iran and a writer for The Bulwark. He studied strategic studies at Johns Hopkins University's Center for Strategic and International Studies, and he writes the Substack newsletter, The Russia-Iran File. He grew up in Iran, but is now a political asylee in the US, living in Washington, D.C. Welcome again, Shay.
Thanks, Cliff. It's good to be with you.
Just for the viewers, I will discuss some of these issues with Shay, but there will be time for Q&A at the end. If you want to ask a question, just type it into the Q&A box, and hopefully we will get to it at the end. So, Shay, let's just start with the obvious, given your background in both Russia and Iran. What is the Iranian regime's view of the war between Russia and Ukraine, and how does the Russian-Iranian relationship affect what is happening between Russia and Ukraine going forward?
So actually, let me start with the fact that Iran is mostly concerned with the negotiations going on about the resuscitation of the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action right now, and that caused some headaches early on the war because Russia was asking for some exemptions that United States was not willing to concede, and that also created some minor rifts between the Iranians and the Russians. And add to this fact that United States and Russia still are not, and United States and Iran are still not negotiating directly. They're using Russia as an intermediary, which adds to the dilemma for Iran and the Russians in this scenario. So the initial reaction of Iran was being supportive of Russia, and it, to the extent that it's still talked about within regime circles, that's different, what different segments of the population is saying. But what they still want to blame the United States, NATO, and basically parrot what the Russians have been saying about the war, not to the extent that not so much parroting what the Russians are saying about Ukraine, but what the Russians are saying about NATO and the United States, I must add. And that has been toned down a little bit, mostly because it's going out of the headlines, and also because it is creating some rifts inside the regime itself. And when I say the regime, I don't mean only government officials, but also the segments of the population that support the regime. Russia has historically been very unpopular in Iran because of many wars that have been fought and many land grabs that Russia has done to Iran, including Turkmenchai and Golistan treaties that Iranians deem unfavorable. And I grant that they were unfavorable and they were exploitations of very incompetent monarchies, or monarchs rather. But because of that and events and Russians meddling in Iranian politics, as well as the Brits for centuries, the Russians are not any more popular than within the Iranian population I'm talking about, not just the regime, any more than the Brits are. The two of them were used historically by different regimes to balance each other's influence, but especially during the Qajar era. And nevertheless, they caused a lot of harm. Because of that, there was a pro-Iranian statesman who once said, turn your back to the Brits and the Russians and hold the hands of the Americans. So that has been a problem for the regime to improve the image of the Russians to a very resistant population, including, again, supporters of the regime and the segments and officials even. You see in Iran's parliament, people frequently complain about the Russians. There was a long saga of the transfer of the purchase of S-300 systems from Russia that was delayed, and the price was high and this and that, but the Russians were not being cooperative. And that had to do also with Iran's nuclear program, which the Russians are not fans of. They want a nuclear monopoly in that region. Nevertheless, created some rift with Russia. And there are other problems, such as the contracts that the Russians had that never delivered of building the Bushehr nuclear reactor, and other problems. So it has been quite interesting to watch how the regime is trying to defend a country or another regime, I guess, Putin's regime. Actually, let me rephrase. Iran's regime's problem is not Putin's regime. It's the entirety of the country of Russia, its history vis-a-vis Iran, and also the atrocities that are happening in Ukraine. And it has been a wedge within the regime itself and between the regime and its supporters. And last thing I want to add is you see very interesting comments made by regime supporters who would say, oh, what Russia is doing to Ukraine would happen to us, not by the Russians, by Americans, if not for the IRGC. Mm-hmm. Which is, the nonsense of it aside, it is still quite fascinating that a country that is supposed to be an ally of the Islamic Republic of Iran, Iranians, even the supporters of the regime, are acknowledging the atrocities. When you see what's happening to them, if not for the IRGC, would happen to us. It means that what's happening to the Ukrainians, you're acknowledging what is happening to Ukrainians.
That's interesting. That actually leads to something else that you've alluded to a couple times that I was going to ask about. You tweeted a video a couple months ago that I noticed that was of a bunch of protesters in front of the Russian embassy in Tehran, of people chanting "Death to Putin." You've alluded to this several times, but how large of a segment of the Iranian population do you think views Russia as hostilely as that? And is it a particular group or subgroup? What else should we know about them?
So if you think about it, at the risk of oversimplification. You could comfortably assume that a significant portion of regime supporters do not like Russia or hate Russia, and every regime opponent hates Russia. Because, again, the population writ large has its historical reasons not to like Russia, to hate Russia, which you can see among regime supporters and average Iranian. But the average Iranian also has the additional incentive that you hate your enemy's friend. It is quite. I always go back and forth deciding whether Iranians hate the Brits more or the Russians, but increasingly it's the Russians, and actually even the Chinese are replacing the Russians. The Brits in number 2, because as the regime becomes more unpopular, which has happened since 2017, I want to say. Since 2015, that the regime's decline in popularity started right after JCPOA, and because of JCPOA, in fact. As that sudden dip happened, so did the popularity of the regime's friends. And the video you talk about, there were also other videos, people and images. People were in front of the Ukrainian embassy protesting in support of Ukraine. They were vandalizing the Russian embassy in Tehran. And that is, but that was partially due to just moral outrage, like the liberal moral outrage that, when I say liberal, I mean classically liberal moral outrage that we've seen in many free societies, including, I would assume, everybody on this chat, on this conversation. In addition to that, it's the element of Iranians just hate Russia and they hate the regime. It was all in one. Now, it has not been manifested the way it has been here, because Europe is not the primary concern of the average Iranian. Iran is the primary concern of the average Iranian. And by the way, there's you cannot say that about Americans, because Americans actually, we do have a comfortable life here. So we have the privilege of caring about other countries more. Iranians do not have that privilege. They're extremely miserable. So first and foremost, they care about their own well-being and affairs. So mostly they still care about the results of the negotiations with P5+1, but that is not stopping them from still expressing outrage whenever they can against Russia. Just that's not the primary concern.
Let me ask you about a related item. Iran. How do you believe Iran's Arab foes, particularly Saudi Arabia and UAE, responded to this conflict, and how has Iran played into the various decisions they've made since the conflict in Russia has started, or in Ukraine, I should say?
That's, to be quite honest, that's a bit difficult to analyze, at least for me. But let me tell you what I know, which is, I believe it was 2 months ago, or maybe a bit more, that the Houthis used an Iranian UAV to attack United Arab Emirates. UAV and UAE, it's a bit of a tongue twister. The United States took weeks to issue a condemnation, weeks, the State Department. And I think it took 20 days, maybe more, to send an official to UAE. And when they did that, it was a military officer who went there. It was not a political appointee. It was not a civilian, which doesn't look good on us. So the Emiratis are quite pissed about that, and they should be. On top of that, the current administration has quite dismissed, and not just that, ignored the reservations that the Emiratis and the Saudis have about the JCPOA. I think it was last week that Jake Sullivan went to Saudi Arabia to be screamed at by Mohammed bin Salman, Mohammed bin Salman, to come back. And early on into the administration, they actually issued they sent signals that were quite tough on Saudi Arabia. And by the way, I didn't disagree with it at the time, and I still don't disagree with what they did at the time. It's just that they have not done anything else to build capital to spend it. So they have run out of capital with the Saudis and slightly lesser extent Emiratis. And yeah, and now the war has given the Saudis and Emiratis leverage because we need them to pump more oil, and they're not doing so. What is quite interesting to me, though, is that, well, if Saudis are not pumping oil, and if the Emiratis are not pumping oil, and if you need more oil, you will have to find it in Venezuela and Iran. And probably for both domestic political reasons, but also prudential policy reasons, they still have not completely caved to reach a nuclear agreement with Iran to return Iran's oil into the market, which is actually commendable. But having said that, their lives would have been much easier if they actually had maintained a good relationship with the Saudis and especially Emiratis. Again, you can condemn Mohammed bin Salman and human rights atrocities. In fact, I've been saying for many years that we're guilty of not doing enough without completely killing the relationship. You can do both. In fact, if history is any guide, the Reagan administration succeeded in democratizing many allies because precisely they had good relations with them, not bad relations, which is a lesson that the current administration hasn't learned.
Okay. Let's get to a couple of audience questions here. You discussed how the Iranians and Russians have had some tension over what has happened to the deal because of the war. What can be done to drive the wedge deeper between Iran and Russia concerning Ukraine? Is there anything that the US or its allies can do?
Between the regime and
between the Russian and Iranian regimes?
Yeah, on the margins, sure. But at the end of the day, Iranians need the Russians and Russians need the Iranians. Iran just signed a 25-year security agreement with China a year ago, I think, which just went into effect last month. And on top of that, and they're trying to reach a new agreement with Russia with the same length, a quarter century. And they might give a Persian Gulf military port to the Chinese. And the Russians would love to have that as well, though there's a different question whether they have the Navy. They think they have to operate out of that port. But no, it's quite difficult to do that, actually. A better way, if you want to do that, a better way is to have information campaigns targeting the regime's supporters who would exert pressure on the regime. The regime wouldn't care about what my parents want. They care about what their supporters want. People who go to mosque every month and show up at the Basij events. So a better way is to actually have information campaigns about that. And what the war is doing, it's not going to achieve that really. If you want to achieve that, you need to target core ideological and historical grievances that these people might have against Russia. One is that well, Russia keeps promising a delivery of weapons and doesn't give it to you. Another one is Russian treatment of Ukrainian Tatars in Russia who are Muslim. Why is Russia discriminating against its Muslims? Another one is, and by the way, we can and should do that about Uyghurs too. The average Iranian doesn't even know what's happening with Uyghurs. Another thing that we can and should do is reminding regimes base of the historical grievances they have against Russia. But the war, I don't think, can do much. To begin with, the regime has done quite the same, not only to its own people, but also to the Syrians. So I don't think that those kinds of atrocities is something that average regime supporter would mind much.
As far as the outrage expressed at the Russians by the opponents of the regime and some of the fans of the regime, as you mentioned, has the Iranians done anything to respond to that, or have they just sort of let that play out domestically?
About the atrocities?
Yeah, I mean, the Iranian protests over Russia's atrocities.
So they were sporadic and small and cracked down on quite easily. It was nothing serious to scare the regime, and they just, again, let it play out, run their own media campaign to address the situation. Actually, by the way, of the media campaign, actually, this is quite an interesting point. The average Iranian is far more familiar with what's happening in Ukraine than the average Russian is. And this is despite the fact, and somewhat because of the fact, that Iranian media are far more restricted and censored than Russian media. And the problem for that is that the Russian media is actually not as religiously orthodox as the Iranian media is. So the regime made a miscalculation of imposing strict Islamic norms to its media. So everybody, starting 25 years ago, set up satellite dishes, and nobody watches domestic media anymore. Everybody watches foreign broadcasts, including Farsi foreign broadcasts. The Russians don't have that problem. They're what they have on state media is actually interesting. The TV shows they have, it's within the norm of what the average Russian would want to see. So they do not have the infrastructure to look at foreign broadcasts, uncensored media. So because of that, the Iranians actually are quite aware of what's happening in Ukraine. It's just that whatever propaganda campaign the regime has had has not been that effective on most people.
This is from, excuse me if I'm butchering this name, Mirdad Khatiri. He asks, are people in the Iranian regime seeing Russia as obstructing the negotiations for a revived JCPOA, given that their main concern is getting access to the funds that will become available to them if an agreement is signed?
Where did the question go? So I was looking. Oh, here it is.
Yeah,
so
I can read.
I'm looking at it. So who are the key people within the regime? That's the biggest question. And yes, they are seeing it as an obstruction or obstructionist actor in the negotiations. Since the war started, they were not quite happy with the Russians last time in 2014 either. 2013, 2014, they were not very too happy with the Russians at the time. And it's understandable because the Russians have their own, they are not representative of Iran's interests. They are representative of their own interests first and foremost. And the Russians have been quite clear, they don't want Iran to get nuclear weapons. And they're right for their own interests, not from our point of view, not to want Iran to have nukes. Yes, they're seeing such obstructions, and they want to reach a deal to get the funds, but I don't agree that their main concern is getting access to the funds. I think their main concern still is to have an agreement that that allows them to get nuclear capabilities, be it by cheating a loosely monitored, observed agreement, or a loosely written that, even if abided by, allows Iran to reach nuclear capabilities, acquire nuclear capabilities. So I think that's their main concern right now. I do think that they care about the money. Of course they do. But I think there's something they care about more, which is the acquisition of nuclear arms.
Let me ask you one other question. Turkey has been playing an interesting role in all of this. They have, basically are acting as an intermediary right now in terms of a setting ground for negotiations between Russia and Ukraine. Turkey's relationship with Iran has always been a bit odd to me. Is there anything that is noteworthy in how this is affecting the Turkey-Iran relationship?
You need to remember that Turkey is a revanchist empire. It, like Russia, wants its empire back. And Iran is some of the different revanchist power, but it also wants its empire back. Though Turkey wants the empire it had back, Iran wants a very different kind of empire. Instead of a nationalist empire, it wants an Islamist empire. But that's a problem. They are both appealing to Islamist tendencies, or Islamic tendencies, I should say, in the region, to portray themselves as the defender of the Ummah, of the Muslim nation. More and more over the past couple of decades, Iran has been leaning on dropping the Islamic Act and more adopting a Shiite clothing, which again brings more tension. On top of that, Iran and Turkey have had their historical problems with each other. Several wars that were fought during the Safavid dynasty, and by the way, when I talk about these historical grievances, it's actually quite interesting because you learn there's a national curriculum there are national curricula for different classes in Iran that everybody reads the same textbook when you're at school, and you learn about all of these. The regime, since age of 10, when you have your first history class, teaches you about the wars and exploitations of by Russia, by Turkey, by the United States and the United Kingdom too, as well. Though the American exploitations are more fabricated than real, but they teach you about these, and they have a population that is not very friendly toward Turkey and toward Russia. As for Turkey, there was the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict last year, and Iran ends up on Armenia's side, and Turkey and Pakistan end up on Azerbaijan's side. And that is quite concerning for Iran, one, because they have separatists in Azerbaijan, but in Iran, and they themselves call themselves Turks. So they are very sympathetic with Turkey. Turkey is sympathetic with them. They fear secession and even annexation. In fact, after World War II, Soviet Union wanted to annex it and refused to leave it until Truman threatened to nuke Moscow, in fact. But there are these problems that Iran has with Turkey that, yet again, this conflict is bringing to surface. It's quite interesting. Every grievance you have had, this war is magnifying. But Iran is quite actually, again, Turkey, I think, is the second or third largest NATO power, military power. And Iran is quite intimidated by Turkey. Cannot attack Turkey for sure, because suddenly it's an Article 5 saying that, unlike Russia, NATO is more than happy to go to war with Iran because Iran doesn't have nukes. On top of that, you see some interesting developments in Turkey. You see that I think it was the president of Turkey and president of Israel, I believe it was the heads of states, who had a phone call, and Turkey is changing some policies to adopt a more Israel-friendly posture in recent weeks, which, one, Iran doesn't like, two, is going to be happy to exploit to the anti-Zionist tendencies in the region. But it's really a mishmash. It's really a mishmash, especially when everything in that region is a mishmash. We've been observing that region for many years, and nothing makes sense.
That is very true. We'll have to leave it for today. We're out of time. Thank you very much, Shay, for your thoughts, and tune in next week, folks, for more stuff from the Middle East Forum. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Cliff.